Welcome, everyone, to our series that's a dialogue, a meeting between compassionate inquiry and internal family systems, a dialogue between Gabor Maté and Dick Schwartz. And thank you all to our live audience for being here with us and bringing your presence, your compassionate presence, and your curiosity and your good questions. Thank you. To begin, I want to open it up to Gabor and Dick to see if there are any threads that you want to pick up on of what's happened so far that's brought us to this moment.
What I'd add about shame is that it happens long before we did anything wrong.
Yeah.
So we always think we feel ashamed because of what we did. But as I said yesterday, the shame precedes it. You can
Totally agree.
You can induce shame in a 9-month-old baby who has no concept of having done anything wrong.
Yeah.
Because I said yesterday, shame is fundamentally an emotional physiological reaction. It looks like this. And you can shame a baby. You know how you do it? You break eye contact. And the first reaction will be anger and trying to get the eye contact reestablished. And then when that fails, the baby goes into a shame state. So the shame is because somebody important broke contact with you. And then you made to feel that this loss of contact was your fault.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the source of shame. It has nothing to do with you having done anything wrong.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the first point. I wanted to follow up on a couple of things in relationship to addiction. And we talked a little bit about maybe didn't, about the neurobiology of addiction. But I mentioned that we have these different brain systems, these emotional systems, described by the great neuroscientist, Dr. Jaak Panksepp. And so we have this care system that makes us care for one another, that makes the mother and the father and everybody want to look after the baby. That's a physiological system in our brains. And it runs on chemicals like oxytocin and vasopressin and our endorphins. And endorphins are internal opiates. We also have the panic grief system that I mentioned. Now, when the care system is activated, that soothes the panic grief system. That's what you saw yesterday with Ken. That's what the work that Dick does. It's not just the modality that he uses, that I use. It's the quality of caring that helps to soothe the fear system and the grief panic system in the client that we're working with. That has an effect on the brain. And you can see it because the person's physical appearance changes.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a very natural process. So this is the importance of relationship.
Gabor, I'm really glad you brought that up, and I wanted to just ask a further question about that, because after yesterday, what was really impressed upon me, one thing that was impressed upon me, was how the compassionate presence that both you offer and Dick offers when you're taking people through a process is in and of itself such a medicine in the system. And also how when the person can access their own compassion towards themselves, and that's where my question is, how does that change our brain function when we're able to access that compassion towards ourselves, even when there's something painful going on in our experience?
Well, as our mutual friend, the mutual friend of both Dix and I, Dr. Stephen Porges, would point out that a different part of the nervous system is activated. And we go into a healing mode, a restorative mode. Different nerve discharges happen from the brainstem, going to the heart and the lungs, and the breathing changes, and the heart rhythm changes, and the visceral and the gut changes, and so on. So that this is where the conversation today, which will be about illness, you can't separate the mind and the body. So when that compassion arises, the internal physiology changes, and the person goes into a mode where growth can take place. Does that answer your question?
It does, yeah. Thank you.
I want to go into more detail, but that's in a nutshell. Now, I wanted to make a comment on the exercise I gave about working with addictive impulses. So the idea of that particular exercise, little exercise, was just to gain some space. But after that, if you still feel like reaching for the cell phone, for God's sakes, do it. Or if you're having that cigarette, do it. Or going shopping, do it. But do it consciously and make it a choice. I want to soothing right now. I'm going to use this to soothe myself. So it's not a question of forbidding yourself to do anything. That never works in the long term. But of doing it with consciousness, with awareness, if you're going to do it. Okay? And then the final comment I wanted to make from yesterday is, as I'm engaging in this process with Dick and all the participants, and with your facilitation, Tami, I'm getting more and more clear on similarities and differences amongst our two approaches. And what I'm seeing is that the outcomes that we're seeking are exactly the same. We're looking for exactly the same outcome. It's just that the approach is different. So for me, when a part now chooses a more beneficial and benign and self-honoring activity, like somebody's part yesterday chose to look for healthy foods, right? That's great. It's also my goal and the goal of compassion inquiry. We just don't put it in the language of parts. We just believe that intuitively, as people clear out the traumatic debris, those genuine impulses of caring for oneself and others emerge. Whether we call them parts or whether we don't call them parts, I'm just talking about my perspective here, it's the same healthy, natural, God-given impulse will emerge. And sometimes it emerges in people's consciousness even before they go to the healing. I'm telling you, I've had so many severely drug-addicted clients tell me, Doc, if I ever get through this, I'm going to dedicate the rest of my life to making sure that nobody needs to suffer like the way I've suffered, and that no child is treated the way I was treated. So that positive impulse, that's, I think, what they could call an aspect of the genuine self. And that's what I would call it as well. And I'm saying that emerges no matter what you call it, whether you call it a part or whether you don't, it's going to come up. We just work with it differently, that's all.
Dick, any comment?
Yeah, I could say a few things about that. Recently, both Gabor and I were on did a series of talks, not together, but separately, with a guy named David Nutt, who has done enormous amount of research around psychedelics and therapy. And I was fascinated by his slides of brain scans, because I think, in addition to what Gabor was talking about, what happens in the brain when you access self, what he was finding, and maybe tomorrow we can talk more about psychedelics and spirituality and things like that. But the point I'm making here is what he was seeing over and over was how much these default mode networks actually go to sleep. They just shut down when you go into a psychedelic medicine state.
Can you say something? Can you explain to people what default mode is, in case people don't know?
Could you, Gabor? Because you're the doctor. Basically, it's the mode you're in most of the time.
Exactly.
When your parts are there, when your parts are ruminating and active, your managers are going, that's the default network, and that just shuts down.
Yeah, in psychedelics. Yeah.
In psychedelics. And for me, when I've done psychedelics and when I had people with me when I did it, for whatever reason, I've always said this, the protectors just go to sleep, or they just relax, and you're in a state of a very high level of self. So for me, I think that's part of what happens when you access what we're both accessing in clients. There's these protectors, these managers, open space for you to be much more present. And when you as a facilitator or a therapist can be in that state, it's like a tuning fork. It starts the resonance of the client self. And so self is contagious is basically what I'm trying to say. And, we're experiencing a little of that just in our group this week, where the more the three of us get into the self, the more everybody feels comfortable, the quicker we go to deeper places and so on. So I think that's what I wanted to say in response.
Absolutely. I agree totally.
And just to share a question that's come up from the group, you said the outcomes are the same, approaches are different. What about blending these two approaches when working with a client? Do you recommend against that, for that? How would you blend them?
Well, let me answer for myself, because that's what I don't think that Dick will tell us for sure, but I don't think his model accommodates that as much, but maybe it does. I mean, I would be surprised, but I'd be happy to be told otherwise. For my own students, I tell them to study family systems, internal family systems. And some of our senior facilitators have taken the internal family systems course or continue to take it now. And that's why we brought in Dick to come and talk to the therapists that are studying my program. So we want them to know about IFS, and sometimes we want them, if they're skillful at it, to work with parts. So from our point of view, it's not exclusive. I don't see completion inquiry as kind of a exclusive modality. I call it an approach. It's a certain approach, but it certainly can learn from and be enriched by other modalities, and very saliently IFS, which again, I recommended it to my students.
Thank you for that. And you might be surprised to hear this, but particularly after this week, I see a lot of things we could incorporate. And I think you're a genius, for example, at through the interviewing process, like I think I might have mentioned this yesterday, at helping people notice parts that they're so blended with otherwise, that these protectors that they don't even know they're protectors.
Yeah.
And helping through your Socratic questions, helping them separate from those protectors and start to examine them and examine the beliefs of those protectors very quickly, like amazingly quickly. And that is something we don't do in a, what's the word? We don't always do. We kind of ask the client where they want to go, and we go with where they want to go. So something like that. There have been a number of questions. I love the question you asked at the end. Like, if you were watching you do this process, how would you feel about this person doing this process? I think that's wonderful. Kind of shame dissolving question. So anyway, but the point I'm making is I do think there are ways to bring these together, and that's been a delight for me just to be with you this week.